The parole board has had its say and it's official, the inmate is going home. They're now free on parole, but the time they spent in prison will be lingering long after they walk out the doors. Prison can be a place of rehabilitation and contemplation, but it can also be a very difficult place to survive. Inmates often come there in an agitated state of mind, and they're paired with other potentially violent inmates and with guards who are taught to show zero tolerance for convicts stepping out of line. That's an explosive combination, and it often leaves ex-cons with some disturbing memories when they finally go home. These are some of the most messed up things ex-cons reported seeing during their time in prison. When you go to prison, who you'll get as a cellmate is anyone's guess, and there's no asking for reassignments like you're in summer camp. When one prisoner arrived, he was given a roommate who seemed like a normal guy, but at night, it was a different story. As he would lie awake at night, he would hear his roommate mumble in his sleep, "I'm a murderer. I'm gonna kill you." When he woke his roommate up, the roommate remembered nothing, and he never acted violently toward him, although he did keep taking his sandals. Who you encounter in prison is the luck of the draw, and sometimes it can be terrifying. One man was trying to serve his prison sentence quietly and was sitting in the common room watching the news. It was a disturbing true crime story about a young man who had stabbed 2 local children and had been arrested. The news fan looked around the room and saw the same face he had just seen on the news sitting right next to him. Apparently, this was a general holding facility for all local criminals, no matter how dangerous. Fortunately, the stabber seemed more interested in breakfast that day. Entertainment is the only thing to look forward to in prison, even if it sometimes leads to disturbing confessions. A group of prisoners were allowed to watch a movie, and surprisingly, it was a horror movie. The guards didn't seem to think it would give them any ideas, and most of them were enjoying the slasher film. But as the killer snuck up behind an unfortunate victim on screen and slit her throat, one audience member didn't seem to be enjoying himself. He scoffed and said, "That's not what it looks like," as the rest of the prisoners in the room were left to wonder how exactly he knew from personal experience. When you don't get much entertainment, almost anything can turn violent. In some prisons, the inmates get to choose their own entertainment as long as they don't cause any trouble. Of course, they don't always agree. In one prison, a trio of older Vietnam veteran inmates had commandeered the TV to watch their favorite shows on the History Channel. But a young drug dealer who had just arrived didn't understand the pecking order, and he wasn't about to miss an episode of his favorite TV show, Breaking Bad. It nearly turned into a massive brawl before the guards interfered. It doesn't take much to start violence in prison, and sometimes it's just bad luck. A guy was doing a stint in prison along with some hardened criminals. Among the most notorious were a pair of murderers who were doing life sentences in another prison but had been transferred back to the general holding facility for a retrial. That was bad luck for an enemy of theirs who had been picked up for a DUI. He was only going to be there until he could see a judge on Monday. But he wouldn't make it to then because his old enemies made a point of hunting him down and killing him. If you anger the wrong person in prison, you'd better watch your back. Prisons have their own economy, and it's not uncommon for inmates to get deep in debt. But in prison, the consequence for being late can be much more serious. One inmate reportedly decided to get himself thrown into solitary to avoid his creditors. He climbed up on the roof of the prison and stayed there for 2 days, while the entire prison was put on lockdown. They eventually got him down, and he spent 2 weeks in solitary and was promptly stabbed when he got out by a random inmate who had to miss his turn in the weight room due to the lockdown. One thing you shouldn't be looking for in prison: privacy. John Williams was an armed robber serving a lengthy sentence, but there was one bright spot in his life: his pet budgie, which inmates were allowed to keep. But birds don't live forever, and one day the bird passed on and Williams gave it a burial in the prison yard. But as he watched out his window that day, he stared in horror as a group of guards walked over to the tree and started digging. They had thought he had buried contraband and instead uncovered a little bird body. They had a good laugh, but Williams wasn't laughing. It wasn't the only strange discovery during Williams' time in prison. While Williams was in prison, another inmate got caught in an awkward situation. A convict was strip-searched after returning to his cell from a job as a trustee, and the guards were shocked when he was found to be wearing women's underwear. After tossing his cell, they found several identical pairs. When questioned, the inmate confessed that he had stolen them from the house of the prison governor where he worked by sneaking into the governor's wife's dresser. That was probably the end of that job. But there were more disturbing collections found in prisoner cells. Justin Rollins was in the healthcare unit for mentally disturbed inmates when a young man was brought in. Many inmates, including Rollins, self-harmed to get transferred to the safer unit, but the new arrival was definitely not pretending. He was escorted by guards wearing hazmat suits, which meant he had been in possession of something contaminated. It turned out that he had been collecting bread to lure pigeons into his cell, at which point he killed them and stored their heads in his pillowcase. Everyone else in the unit gave the pigeon serial killer a wide berth. In prison, people will do anything to distract themselves, even resort to some questionable substitutes. Drug addicts often find themselves needing their next fix, but drugs are hard to come by and dangerous to keep. When a group of female inmates in the county jail were desperate, they found an unconventional solution. When they got their instant coffee powder from the canteen, they didn't mix it with hot water. They snorted it right up their noses for a high-intensity caffeine fix. And the other inmates reported they stayed up all night making weird meowing noises to each other. For alcoholics, finding a suitable replacement can be even trickier. Prison has its own culture, and many inmates have reported it even has its own drink menu. With alcohol strictly prohibited, inmates have taken to home brewing questionable substitutes called Pruno. They collect fruit juice, candy, sugar, and crumbled bread and collect it in a plastic bag, which they fill with hot water. They hide it in a piece of cloth and let it ferment over an extended period, knowing that if it's discovered, they're headed for solitary. The eventual result has been described as tasting vile, but it contains just enough alcohol to be worth it for some. Of course, some inmates manage to get their hands on the real thing. Drugs are pretty common in prison, and some inmates resort to extreme measures to get them. One inmate tried to smuggle a bag of drugs into prison concealed in his rear end, but was quickly discovered. The guards dug it out and planned to seize it as evidence, but the inmate had other plans, and everyone in the prison hospital got to see as he grabbed it and swallowed it again. He was forced to vomit it up by the officers, and he was probably pretty lucky the bag didn't burst. After all, that would have likely been fatal. Uncomfortable as it is, it seems to be a pretty popular hiding place. One inmate was living in a low-security dorm where the inmates had more freedom, and many were smuggling cell phones in. But this was still prohibited, and a violation could easily get them sent back to a more secure prison. When the dorm was raided one day, the inmate watched in shock as at least 5 inmates quickly shoved their cell phones, including some pretty large models where the sun doesn't shine. Even more shocking, every one of them was strip searched and not a cell phone was found. In prison, freedom can disappear at any time, sometimes for the most ridiculous reasons. Stephen Jackley was doing a stint for armed robbery when he suddenly discovered that the prisoner's time in the yard that day had been canceled. Normally, this only happens when there's trouble at the prison or serious bad weather, but today the reason was a cloud. The prison guards had decided that a cloud meant it could rain, and the rain could make the ground unsafe for recreation. Not exactly a reason to cancel a day of outdoor time, but there really isn't a customer service division in the prison. The guards have a lot of power in prison, and sometimes they abuse it. One man was spending a weekend in the LA County Jail after being arrested and just had to get through the weekend. But another inmate wouldn't be so lucky. They were standing on line for inspection when the guard suddenly stopped him, pulled him out of line, and beat him in front of the rest of the line. The inmate never knew why that specific inmate was targeted and saw other inmates obviously smuggling goods. Maybe the poor inmate was just randomly chosen to be an example by abusive guards. But guards aren't always on the ball. When a young man was doing a short stint, one of the inmates he was doing time with was a notorious member of the Mexican mob who was in jail awaiting trial for murder. But that didn't stop him from getting a position on the work release team. One day when he was out doing his job, he just decided to make a break for it. He made a gang sign at the guards, laughed at them, and disappeared while he was at work. He was never seen again and was believed to have made it back to Mexico, and the odds are those guards were looking for a new job. Of course, sometimes the inmates fight back against the guards. One man doing time for DUI in the Macomb County Jail reported seeing an inmate who'd had enough. He started repeatedly dipping his shirt in the toilet, wringing it out, and wrapping it around his head. Most people thought he was crazy, but he said he needed it to block out the light. But then the old man scooped some of the toilet water up in a milk carton and waited for an officer to walk in. As soon as the officer barged in to move them to another cell, the old man threw the cup of toilet water right in his face. This turned into a near-prison riot, and the old man was beaten by guards and paraded out in front of the other inmates. But that's nothing compared to the revenge plan the next man cooked up. One inmate shared a story of an HIV-positive inmate who became a legend among his fellow cons. He had been collecting newspapers during his stay and quietly worked on a project by dipping the papers into toilet water, which had the effect of hardening them. No one knew what he was working at until one day the guards came under fire. He had made a makeshift bow and arrows out of the petrified newspaper and some string, and had apparently even coated the arrows in his blood to potentially infect the guards. No one knows if any arrows hit their target, but it's hard to imagine paper arrows could actually pierce the guard's clothing. But the next inmate took his revenge plot to the next level. Siri Sesto Stokes was a frequent flyer at a Welsh prison, but nothing prepared him for what he was going to see this time. He shared a prison with a young Irish inmate who loved to boast that he knew how to make bombs. No one believed him. until one day he showed up with what looked like a bomb and took a female guard hostage. The guard had apparently made a lot of enemies among the men, and this hostage situation led to a riot in the whole wing. By the time the guards calmed the riot and broke into the office where the hostage taker was, the riot had made the news. As for the bomb, it turned out to be a flask with some wires in it, completely harmless, but enough to turn a prison upside down for days and send the would-be bomber to a much longer stint in prison. For more on what you'll need to know to get out of a prison stint alive, watch The 10 Commandments of Prison, or check out this video instead.